All right. Well, there's already like 20 people, so
Okay.
we're live. I'm accompanied by Tokenbrownie today on TikTok, and we will be having a discussion, sort of an informal discussion about feminism, specifically maybe the contentions that he holds with modern day feminism and how I think those could be solved, or even if they exist. So, if you have anything you want to start with, you can go ahead and start.
Oh, you want to start right now, or should we wait for more people to join?
We can just start right now.
Okay. So I'm Token. I consider myself a feminist, but I do have some qualms with the modern interpretation of feminism. I think the first one we'll find more agreeable, and the second one we won't. So I'll just start with that. So the first qualm I truly have with modern day feminism is making oppression a competition. I'm just going to read out some stuff that I have written down. Keep in mind that, considering the fact that this is just like an informal discussion or a table talk, I don't necessarily have much empiricism with me. But if you disagree, we can talk about that too. I feel that there's a problem with self-proclaimed feminists weaponizing feminism into a man versus woman issue instead of supporting feminism for what it is, a proclamation of true social and cultural equality, which should be achieved through means of dismantling the patriarchy. For example, when men talk about men's issues in society, self-proclaimed feminists are quick to jump on the train of, well, men created those issues in the first place, as if it's even a remotely valid critique. Instead of blaming men as a monolith for the social and cultural standards that they have inherited, we must attribute blame to the systems in place which force men to conform to such standards in the first place. The fact of the matter is that to blame the issues of an ingrained patriarchy on any individual man who is a pawn of the patriarchy is regressive. Targeting the leaves of a plant will not kill the plant, but cutting off its roots will. Targeting individual men who may perpetuate the patriarchy unknowingly will not end the patriarchy. If anything, it will cause unnecessary hatred towards feminism, and it will start to alienate people from the concept of true equality. To be more specific, if a man speaks out about things like the increased suicide rate amongst men, the first response should never be, well, men created those problems for themselves. That's a stupid take. Common male in society today did not formulate the patriarchy. Their attitudes have been shaped by the patriarchy since day one. We must attribute blame where it is truly present, the patriarchy, which perpetuates toxic masculinity and femininity, which is regressive and harmful to the general populace. To blame any individual man for the faults of the patriarchy is to ask someone to be a statistical outlier in a system that churns out men ingrained with aspects of toxic masculinity. Such thinking of the individualistic view of the patriarchy is fundamentally myopic. We as a collective are responsible for helping people escape the clutches of the patriarchy. Feminism is too weaponized and uninviting in the status quo for it to truly garner that change. I believe that there's a reason why men are so hesitant in the status quo to identify themselves as feminists. And this problem lies in feminists of self-proclaimed feminists vilifying men holistically who are a product of a harmful system instead of critiquing the system itself and providing solutions.
Okay. So I think that there's a point of contention is in what we interpret to be the representation of feminism. So I think that feminism itself, I wouldn't characterize it as this reactionary movement against toxic masculinity or whatnot that seems to be gatekeeped. And I think that a lot of young men hold this view simply due to the things that were presented to them regarding feminism at a young age. So for me, for example, you probably went through this phase too. When I was younger, ninth, 8th, 9th grade, I would watch H3 videos.
Oh yeah, me too.
Nonstop, right? And in retrospect, it was quite damaging because what they did is, and this was a whole subgenre of YouTube content at the time, and it really extrapolated.
Was it the BuzzFeed rebuttals?
Huh?
Was it the BuzzFeed content that H3 made?
Yeah. Where they would focus in on hyper-specific representations of feminism that didn't really speak to the general feminist movement. And they would try to characterize the entire movement based off these reactionary women, for example, the one that accused that guy of sexual assault for just speaking at, I don't know, what was it, something about a precinct in Seattle.
Yeah.
And these definitely don't represent the general population. And as a result of this, it bred an anti-feminist attitude in men, so much so to a point where when feminists bring up critique of modern day society, there's the reactionary tendency of being well, what about this male issue? What about suicide rates being higher amongst men? And then in that point, feminists will be well, that's simply a result of the patriarchy that you are yourself upkeeping by not engaging in the conversation that feminists are bringing forth to the table. And as a result of that, what the male takes away from that in that situation is simply the response of, oh, well, that's a result of the patriarchy. They take it as an attack on masculinity, which it's really not. And as a result of this climate, this reactionary climate that's been bred by men, you're not going to forward any sort of conversation.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think there's reactionary people on either end of the spectrum, both self-proclaimed feminists and people who consider themselves not feminists because they don't believe that feminism is truly for equality. I think as a kid, I used to watch A3HG productions as well, and I'd watch, the the videos on manspreading and mansplaining, and I was immediately turned off at the concept of feminism because, as you stated, I would think that feminism was more an attack on like these really minuscule things, like mansplaining. I was really turned off by these concepts, but as I grew more and as I analyzed the world more and how I perceive my own biases, I learned that the representations of any group really and like what the media at least portrays are usually like the extremes, right? Like no one's going to just talk about like a movement that advocates for equality. Like the media is going to be quick to pounce on things that are crazy, that are going to like want to, that they're going to garner views and attention, clicks, and whatever it may be. So I think there needs to be this sort of education that comes with feminism, because oftentimes, both from self-proclaimed feminists and, reactionaries on the other side, there's a misinterpretation of the message behind feminism. And although I do agree with, attributing blame to the patriarchy, at least anecdotally for me, I see way too many feminists pouncing on the idea of, men, individualistically being at fault for the patriarchy today, when we are truly just, a representation of the society around us and the material conditions that change and shape the way that we behave. Like, I don't believe that any man is born, with traits of toxic masculinity embedded in them, nor do I believe that any female is born with, aspects of toxic femininity, but we're simply products of the material conditions that shape us. And I believe that, perhaps you may not see this, but I do sometimes. Some self-proclaimed feminists need to just take a step back and, start to focus blame on, like shift the attention on education rather than vilification, which, I used to not be a feminist myself. I used to believe that feminism as a whole was like the antagonism of men, like overall. However, it takes like some education, right? I believe that feminism as a whole, it's far too like reactionary. It's just like saying this or X, Y, or Z characteristic is due to the patriarchy pushes away more men who are already in like, for lack of a better word, in like the circle jerk of feminism is like talking about stupid shit like mansplaining instead of actual issues that, pertain to equality. It only pushes those men away instead of creating solidarity, which is why I believe there's such a gap between the amount of women who are, readily who are readily open to just identify themselves as feminists versus a large swath of men who believe that feminism truly isn't for equality in the status quo.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time, though, that individual shaming comes as a result of individual actions, in the sense that men will be so quick to have a reactionary tendency to react to issues that women bring forth. And they're like, oh, well, look at this issue. And then they just want to divert the attention. That happens oftentimes at the individual scale. It's not like a collective thing, but it ends up being a collective thing because so many individual men have this sort of tendency of being like, oh, well, what about this? Or like if someone's like, well, the wage gap. And then they're like, well, that was debunked this many times. And in reality, they've not looked into any of the contentions that have been brought forth. They've just decided that this is an anti-man movement and these issues are non-issues, when in the reality, both of those things, the antithesis is true. So I just want to know, what do you think feminism is needed for today? Where do you think that women may be disproportionately negatively affected in society for feminism to need to be applicated?
Okay, so I believe that, systems that have been placed through, generations of the patriarchy are pretty prevalent even in the status quo. I feel like, many of the disparities when it comes to, types of jobs that women hold, in part maybe due to the patriarchy, in part maybe due to like psychological or hormonal differences. I haven't necessarily looked into the data or the studies for that. I believe that we need to take steps towards egalitarianism more than ever today, and we need to start letting go of like these really primitive traditional values that conservatives usually hold on to. I believe that they're regressive and they're honestly not productive to society at all. We honestly, like, I think reactionaries have like this tendency of just blaming every disparity on this idea that men and women are inherently different. I think there is some merit to that. However, I don't think it's entirely that. Like, I definitely think that there are social stigmas around, women entering certain professions and men entering certain professions. And, socially speaking, we need to start dismantling these ideas and move towards egalitarianism, because true equality isn't just like, in terms of the system. We need to start thinking about social equality in terms of stereotypes that are pushed onto certain genders and whatnot.
Yeah, for sure. I would agree with the notion of stereotyping by gender. And I also would go even further to say that probably the differences in actual psychology and neurology that lead the two genders to go into different fields at the rate they do are minuscule and inconsequential to the actual disparity. The psychology component is probably actually shaped by environmental factors that lead to your developmental I suppose preferences in a sense. And for example, in the 1980s, what really proved this was during the 70s and the 60s, women were going into computer science fields at an astronomically higher rate than ever before. But as soon as the personalized computer was brought to the American household in the late 1980s, early 1990s, what had happened is it was just like a cliff that completely dropped off because the personalized computer was viewed to be a toy for males, right? And as a result of gender roles, men were pressured into computer science fields even more due to practices at home. And as a result of that, women were left behind when they actually try to enter this field. And that's just sort of a microcosm that speaks to the rest of society. I think I myself am a determinist, so I believe that all of your actions are shaped by your environment, right? And if I could properly adjust for all externalities in environment, I think I know pretty much exactly how your life would go. And as a result of that, our focus societally on gender roles for men being one thing and women being the other thing, and the gender roles equated for men generally having a better outcome on life is what leads to that disparity, you know?
Sure. Yeah, I definitely agree with you that there's social stigmas that we need to start breaking down. Could you delve deeper into the causal link between, the introduction of the personalized computer and like the downturn of women entering STEM fields or, computer science specifically?
Yeah, let me find this article.
Yeah, sure. Take your time.
Yeah. Yeah. So I can share screen, right? Okay.
Also, just like a quick question, do you believe that theoretically, if we lived in a society that was purely egalitarian, that we would see no disparities in terms of, professions that people go into?
Perhaps, maybe there's like very, very minuscule differences in the neurology of the brain itself. Generally, people use the psychological argument, right? But that's shaped by environment a lot. Neurological differences.
I mean, I feel like there's more to, the biological
I don't
aspect
think
of it.
I really subscribe to this whole nature versus nurture determining your life path.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with that for the most part. We are shaped by our environment. If we lived in a society where it was more normalized for women to enter fields that are predominantly male dominated, it'd switch. But I believe that there is some bearing of in biology at least. I mean, maybe looking into hormonal differences. I mean, there's far more than just neurology. I know that brain structure wise, women and men have like very minuscule differences.
Yes.
But how it necessarily manifests in differences in society, I'd have to look deeper into, especially hormonal differences, because I know that most of the difference between men and women, the hormonal makeup.
Yeah, last time I looked into that, I realized that it's something that scientists refer to as neurosexism, when people try to overrepresent the neurological differences between men and females. And they'll take studies, for example, where there's one study where it said 96% of scientists could identify, or neurologists could identify, a gendered brain. And the result of that is because they're hyper specifically trained to identify differences in a brain, right? And these brain differences are still very small, but it's not small enough to a point where they could actually identify the differences, but that doesn't really speak to a real world application of preference. So I think that's like a slippery slope that I wouldn't really want to go down. This article is pretty lengthy, but we could just like skim over it. So obviously, am I screen sharing? I think I am screen sharing. So let me make sure real quick. Okay. Yeah, I am. Okay. So obviously you see the trends here: medical school, law school, physical sciences, all going up, right? And then you see this steep increase, and then all of a sudden it just plummets in the late 1980s.
Sure.
They did like a bunch of studies, for example, Jane Margolis, and she found that families were more likely to buy computers for boys than for girls. And that is pretty much the only explainable externality that can be attributed to this based off what I've seen. I've looked at other things too specifically. And then,
repeat the last part. Boys were what? Sorry, I wasn't listening.
It's just skipped it again. Oh yeah, families were more likely to buy computers for boys than for girls.
Why?
Because of the preference of because of the gender roles attributed with that situation, right? There are female toys, male toys, right? This is far more of an intellectual toy, and as a result of that, gender.
Oh yeah, okay, makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And as a result of that,
could you go up to like the other fields, the graph?
Yeah. since there is no like personal component to these that would cause for a difference in development, right? Like I'm not going to buy you like what's that?
I mean, I feel like that's kind of like an ambiguous statement to make. Like, I feel like medical school and law school are pretty intellectual fields to go into.
No, but
I think there's definitely.
I'm saying there's no like component of personalization at home that would lead you to drive you into one of these fields, right? I'm saying that with the introduction of the personal computer, as a result of that, something that's directly contributing to the levels that people go into the field in, for example, in computer science, as a result of that being introduced to the personal home, there was that differentiation because they're like, oh, this is a far more intellectual toy. So this is something that is more for boys. Now, you're not going to have like an intellectual toy that's attributed to medical school or law school. That could be.
I mean, you might.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I have to look into the history of them more.
Like a scanner or something? I don't know. Doesn't seem.
I mean, there are like those toy kits or whatever for doctors or whatnot. I have to look into like the causal link between.
That's not
how many toys are bought for whatever. Like, I feel like there's probably more to that causal link there than just the type of toys that were bought for the kids. But I have to look more into that on my own time.
Yeah, there seems to be a consensus, but okay. So yeah, I think that gender pressuring is definitely majority of the difference in my opinion. Yeah. Beyond that, what else do you think that feminism is needed for, I suppose?
Yeah, okay. Let's go into the second part. Okay, so this is my second major qualm with feminism overall. It's the believe all victims narrative. First, just as like a preface, I'll go into like the false allegation claims that are often made. I know that like the 2 to 10% stat from the CDC is often brought up. It actually says at least 2 to 10%, and I ask questions like, "Have you ever had pity sex?" No, sorry, that wasn't the right stat. It was the 1 in 6 women were raped stat, and like the questionnaire itself asks questions like, have you ever had pity sex, and like the one question it left out was, have you ever been raped? So I believe that, some studies have really ambiguous non-legal definitions of rape. And the false allegation studies I've seen range all the way from 1% to 40%. But in all actuality, I don't believe that there is necessarily a way to parametricize exactly how many allegations are false versus true, because the vast majority of allegations are, they either don't go through the legal system at all. And even if they do, the vast majority of them get dropped for the lack of evidence, which means that it could be up to interpretation of whether or not there's a plausibility of those being true or false. So I believe that, just stating right off the bat, like, only X amount of allegations are false, like versus X amount of allegations are true, is just a really myopic way of looking at the entirety of the situation, because there's not necessarily a consensus on that academically. And I don't believe that there is a methodology that could necessarily discern that in a way that would be accurate to the way our legal system works. But this is my problem more specifically with the believe all victims narrative. Phraseology of the statement procured through the Me Too movement makes me hesitant to follow it. By using the term victim, you're making the implicit assumption that the person being alleged is the perpetrator with no evidence. They're not necessarily studies on the extent to which false allegations can ruin someone's life, and hence all I can truly give you are anecdotes, like the recent case which blew up on social media involving a Nigerian man named Izu who committed suicide because he couldn't tolerate the social ramifications of being falsely accused. Much like the number of true versus false rape cases, the ramifications of false allegations are ambiguous and up for debate. However, I do know one thing. If there was a way to maximize the amount of people who are comfortable coming out about their experiences with sexual assault, while also protecting the accused from social ramifications, I would be behind that movement immediately. I do believe that there are some solutions that we can go through. For example, increased sex education. A first step is to complete a redefinition of our sex education, which is extremely behind, and only truly teaches the anatomy of males and females instead of shifting. Sorry, one second, I'm getting a call. Ma, I'll call you back in a bit. Sorry about that. Okay, give me a moment. Kids are malleable and we need to be able to educate them properly. Education rates about rape are especially low when it comes to males, who are often the perpetrators of rape, which is why as a society we need to focus more on prevention than punishing the accused with no proof after the fact. When it comes to conversations about rape, there's always a false dichotomy that is brought up. You either believe or disbelieve the victim. I believe that this dichotomy is also a reason for my reluctance to buy into the believe all victims narrative. I don't believe that you are obliged to believe or disbelieve a random stranger with no semblance of evidence because of some guilt trip. This, however, does not mean that you must not believe them or be shallow enough to ask them for proof, because obviously something like rape is not going to have proof to it. or video proof or some sort of hard evidence to it. One can simply lack the belief of the validity of an accusation while also providing emotional support to cultivate a culture that doesn't take justice into its own hands, while also allowing more people to come out about their experiences. Above all, there is no easy way to cultivate a social redefinition. The responsibility of the removal of the social stigma around sex lies with the people that make up the populace, and it will be a gradual change. The most one could do is advocate against patriarchal structures and implement such edicts into their own life. Enough personal change will cultivate a slow but steady social redefinition.
Okay, so I would agree to the what was it? I think your first point. Well, actually, so but going back to the study, the 1 in 5 thing, right? So I would agree that like there obviously is a problem with fake allegations in a sense. So those are very detrimental. That's obviously not something that I'm going to contest, right? But I still do believe that the overwhelming majority of women are telling the truth. We can't really. I would agree with the notion that there will be never a definitive numerical amount or like definitive numericism that we could attribute with, oh, this percentage of women weren't telling the truth or whatever, right? But based off microcosms, we could extrapolate that data and try to see what the actual reality of the situation is. The 1 in 5 statistic, you had a contention with the fact that there was a differentiation in the legal definition and that some of those allegations didn't fit the legal definition. But in my opinion, the legal definition isn't extensive enough, I guess, because
well, yeah, sure, but the way I see
coercion of sex to me is still definitely rape. Like I would die on that hill for sure. If you coerce someone into sex, that in my opinion is a variation of sexual assault. And that's one of the things that is mentioned in the CDC study. And as a result of that, that's a pretty substantial part of it, I'm pretty sure. And that's the reason that it contributes to such a high rate as in 1 in 5, right?
Sure. I mean, define the coercion of sex. Like, give me like a hypothetical.
Okay. So coercion of sex, I suppose blackmailing would be an example, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah.
Even beyond that, that's a bit of an extremity, but even
however, like some of the questions that were asked were like, this is verbatim looking at one of the questions, did you have pity sex? And I would not consider pity sex to be rape because, it's not necessarily one person manipulating another person. It's just two people acting on emotions.
There most definitely could be emotional manipulation in that situation that could lead to coercion, right?
Perhaps, but
sex with
I don't necessarily believe
myself, right? That seems to be coercive in nature, and that would be characterized as pity sex in a sense, right? I know emotional manipulation is very rampant in a sense, and that can contribute to the fact that it is 1 in 5. I tend to, when I see a study, I tend to not try to engage in conjecture, right? As in, why could these conclusions be wrong? Because really, I don't have the expertise to judge that in a way. And as a result of that, I'm going to go off the prescriptions that the study made. The 1 in 5 seems to be quite feasible. I don't really have a reason to be a contrarian in a sense. Pity sex, once again, can be characterized by emotional manipulation. So I don't think that really discredits the study in any way.
Pity sex, I mean, I'm just using Urban Dictionary here because it's not necessarily a formal term, but it's when girls have sex with guys because they feel bad for them. I don't necessarily think that's emotional manipulation, nor do I believe that there is necessarily a perpetrator in that situation. I think it's just like, almost like someone feeling guilty for them, for like another person.
Right? That doesn't transpire vacuously, right? There might be emotional pressure in that situation. Oh, if you don't have sex with me, I'll kill myself, like that type of situation. It seems extreme, but I know individuals.
I mean, I guess it's like an all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares kind of situation. Like, pity sex could be some sort of emotional manipulation, but it could also just be someone feeling bad for another person and not necessarily being forced into doing it, but doing it because they want to maybe cheer another person up or something like that. I think there may be an element of emotional coercion.
I think emotional contributors, especially when they manifest themselves as manipulation, would definitely infringe upon the capability to consent. And one of those infringements upon the capability to consent that manifests itself in an emotional sense could lead to quote unquote pity sex as characterized by the study. But I guess even beyond that, there's a differentiation, I suppose, between presentation and internalization in Believe All Women. So that concept, right? I think there's a societal, not indulgence. What's the word I'm looking for? Like a societal expectation, I suppose. Like it's the least you could do to try to believe all women because it kind of takes away the stigma of the victimization. They don't want to be antagonized, right? Now, this doesn't inherently have to be presented or something that is internal. You don't have to internally believe them, right? But as like, don't go out of your way to try to discredit the victim, right? And I think that's the narrative that's trying to be perpetuated, not actually adopt the side of the victim, but just don't contribute to the very dangerous and detrimental climate of stigma that comes into fruition as a result of not believing all victims. And beyond that, in the legal sense, there's always going to be bias in the favor of the perpetrator, quote unquote, well, even if we don't know for sure, because we have innocent until proven guilty, right?
Yeah.
So there's that dichotomy, the societal and the legal. And I think due to the fact that the legal is believe all perpetrators, the balance to that would be,
well, no, the legal isn't believe all perpetrators. The legal is
innocent until proven guilty, right? You're under the presumption that they are innocent, which is inherently believing the perpetrator.
Sure, but like it's not necessarily belief of the perpetrator. It's the lack of belief of the claims of the person who's alleging the claims. I think there's a slight difference here because you're not siding with the perpetrator. It's the skepticism of the claims of the person who's alleging.
That whole concept of innocent until proven guilty means you're going in with the presumption that they're innocent, even though that may not be the case, and they have to prove that they are guilty.
Sure. So again, I feel like we're falling into like this false dichotomy where you have to quote unquote believe all women, even if it's internalized, right? Like when you're talking about a movement that is as large and has such a large following as feminism, I think it's hard to be able to, really control the extent to which that term affects people, because like the way I see it, there are perceived detriments to people who are accused, and especially when feminists take a case and they run with it, I think it's ignorant to say that there aren't ramifications, even in cases where there isn't much substantial proof of people taking justice into their own hands, calling into businesses. It's like this is my qualm with cancel culture as well, and why I'm just not a supporter of cancel culture. What is wrong and right is entirely subjective, and how wrong or how right something is completely subjective too. Which is why like people shouldn't be taking justice into their own hands, dude. When it comes to social ramifications, how much evidence is adequate is also very subjective. Like I obviously believe that our legal system is really trash when it comes to things like rape, because obviously there's not like a good way for you to prove rape in a court of law, which is why I believe that we should be affording our sympathy towards people who do come out. I sincerely don't believe that should be coming at the risk or the cost of people who are who have allegations thrown against them. And you did, I forgot to address something else you said.
I would agree with that notion. I don't think you should be taking it out on the perpetrator, right? I wouldn't agree with that myself. And I think that is what is entailed under believe all women. It's not inherently to go out of your way to push ramifications upon the alleged perpetrator, but just try to help absolve the stigma that comes as a result of accusing someone of, the action. I don't think it inherently has to lead to societal ramifications for the perpetrator. Believe all women until there's a reason not to believe all women, but that doesn't mean go out of your way to try to cause harm or conflict upon the individual who is accused.
Yeah, and I agree with that, but I simply, at least anecdotally, I don't perceive modern day feminism as having, the emotional maturity to be able to differentiate between the two, because there is a group of people who will always go out of their way to do something shitty or to
but I don't think that's representative. Christ, I don't think that's representative of the general movement at all. I personally, I don't know. I think I know 4 victims. All are statutory, and in none of the cases when they came forward was it a situation in which they went out and like the people that they came forward to, myself being one of them in many situations, none of them like decided to go out of their way to try to inflict harm upon the person, right? I think there's
it depends on how much social it depends on how much social power it garners, truly. I mean, like was it just like cases that like, okay, obviously, so here's my thing. Like, obviously, if like a female friend of mine came forward and like she talked about her experiences, I would obviously give her the benefit of the doubt, obviously, right? Because I trust my friends.
That's the premise of the whole thing.
Yeah,
And
but
in reality, we shouldn't be making prescriptions about other situations, right? Believe All Women isn't a movement that's supposed to be at a national sense where we take every single situation of a rape and try to make prescriptions about it. Believe All Women is a microcosm to yourself in your own living situation. By giving the person the benefit of the doubt, you are subscribing to the notion of believe
sure.
all women.
Sure. I mean, if it's like on like a more individualized scale where it's like within your own family members or your friends or like
Which
or
is
your
all it's
acquaintances,
supposed to be.
yeah, like if it's within there and like it's your own social circle where you have your own supporters and you have your family and your friends and you're able to feel comfortable coming out, then absolutely I would support that. But the way I see it, and this is just anecdotes back and forth. Both of us probably have different experiences when it comes to this, so we might not see eye to eye completely. Which is where like a lot of this dichotomy really comes. There's not many studies on this issue because it's a hard thing to
Yeah, you
parametricize.
can't like attribute numericism
Yeah,
to a lot of this. Yeah.
yeah, to like but to the cases that do garner like a crap ton of evidence, there is always going to be like some subsect of people, or obviously there's radicals in every single group, right? There's always going to be a subsect of people who go out of their way to vilify or take retribution into their own hands, which I'll never support. But the terminology of believe all victims itself, it operates on a presumption. Like something that I'm more comfortable supporting is, like maybe a statement that's like support or like destigmatize it. Like I honestly, I don't feel like you need to outwardly believe someone in order to give them emotional support. And like as you said, it may be like an implicit or like inward belief, but I don't necessarily believe that like that's necessarily what that statement is trying to get through.
Well, I think in many cases, belief is the only remedy to the situation because belief is the only thing that would absolve of the stigma to a point where they could present their story properly, right? Otherwise, they feel like, oh, there's always room for antagonizing. And I think you recognize that yourself implicitly. You're just thinking that this is something that's more, I don't want to use the word national, but on a greater societal scale than it's supposed to be. I think Believe All Women is really supposed to be limited to, like your day-to-day functions and situations specific to you. And you yourself said you grant benefit of the doubt in these situations. So feminist
Sure,
came.
but
Feminist
I
came.
mostly I definitely would not go out of my way to draw conclusions on a situation that I was not familiarized with. I would personally not even, want to draw any conclusions or side with anyone. If some random case came forth and it got like a lot of social recognition, I would not necessarily jump to a conclusion, nor would I, outwardly support or not support anyone. But um, I would definitely advocate for people to come out about their experiences, right? Obviously, on an individualized scale, we agree. The extent of the ramifications of which, larger or broader cases can, affect the accused or the accuser are not necessarily easy to parametricize, as we've already gone over.
Yeah.
So I think we practically agree on a lot of things, but our hesitation comes from just mostly anecdotal experiences that we've had when it comes to feminism. So I don't necessarily think that this is something that we're going to be able to change each other's minds on.
Yeah. And I think we've actually, it's been pretty short, but I think we've addressed both points of contention, right? Societal
Yeah.
pressures and victims. I don't see what there is much else to talk about, right?
Yeah. Oh, also, yeah, I forgot to bring this up. There is this tendency on both sides to bring up the opposite when someone talks about their issues, right? Like if a man talks about their suicide rates, like there's like this reactionary, there's like this group of reactionary people who just go, okay, whose fault is that? As if, and it's pretty invalidatory to like, the social consequences that people have inherited, right? And it's the same thing when someone comes out about like a rape case or something, and someone talks about, well, what about false allegations? So, like things that are completely irrelevant to the situation. I think we agree here as well. I think there's a reactionary aspect to both feminists and anti-feminists that needs to be purged. I think it's toxic to the movement. I think it's regressive, and I think it stops a lot of men from joining the movement, especially because it can be perceived as the vilification of men or the ignoring of issues that pertain to men specifically when it comes to society. So, yeah, I think that aspect of feminism needs to be purged.
Yeah, but I think that's fringe, I suppose. And there's no way to quantify it, right? We can only go off
Yeah, exactly.
Anecdotally, but I don't think that speaks to feminism at all. Obviously, there are going to be reactionary individuals with all subsects of ideology and all subsects of thought, but that shouldn't really discredit a movement, I suppose. I can see in certain situations why it would be a deterrent for individuals if they are affected by it on a personal scale, right? Like if
Sure.
But beyond that, I don't think that can be made like indicative of prescriptions made on the entirety of something.
Yeah, I think there is definitely a reason why we see such a gap in, women who are so comfortable as coming out as feminists and men who are just so reluctant to do the same.
Because H3H3.
Yeah, H3H3. And, even modern interpretations of feminism, there needs to be a way to shift this conversation away from pointing fingers and making this an immature gender war, and trying to prove which gender has it worse in society today, to something where we educate people and we start gearing those who did grow up on H3H3 and never really got past that phase of hating feminism because they think it's anti-equality inherently, instead of shifting the blame from the patriarchy versus the people into man versus woman. We should start shifting the focus onto education and teaching men to be better men and teaching women to not play into patriarchal structures. I believe that that's where we agree to with the benefits of feminism and the status quo.
For sure. Well, I guess that's really it. Yeah.
Yeah. We might want to take some questions though.
Sure. My chat isn't loading, so let me pull up the YouTube real quick.
Yeah, mine's good. So if anyone wants to ask any questions, go ahead. Zora says, so basically feminism isn't babying men enough. I don't necessarily see it like that. I believe that men are, at least the majority of men, are only a product of the material conditions around them. I believe that some reactionary feminists only exacerbate the antagonism towards feminism by making it look like a reactionary movement versus true equality, true social equality.
Oh yeah,
which is what pushes men away.
By the way, they want you to say "good girl."
Okay, I'll turn on my camera to you for this. Good girl.
All right, where'd it go? Okay. Someone asked, why don't you believe the patriarchy exists? But I think you do, right?
Yeah. Oh, I commented that just to trigger some of the feminists in my comments.
Oh, okay. There doesn't seem to be many questions simply due to the fact that a majority of the stream is Nance accounts. So
yes,
I think we might as well just end it now.
Yeah, I'm down.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on, brother.
Yep, this was a productive conversation. Hopefully we can have some sort of talk like this again.
Yes, sir.
All right, good talk.
Yep. Thank you all for watching. Peace out.
Peace out.